Welcome to Tilt, a podcast from the Santa Fe Art Institute. We know how the Soldiers Monument met its end, but what's its origin story? Delving deep into the archives, Alicia, Diego, and Christian take it back 152 years to the moment when the obelisk arrived in the Santa Fe Plaza. This is episode 5, part 2, titled, You're Not From Here.
You are listening to Unsettled.
Now you're talking sense.
Got this pine cone in my brain, got my eyes open, I'm saying it's that wake up, that breaking free from them chains. It's that welcome to a new age, this right here feel like a new wave. Third eye open wide.
It's hard to then place blame on that person, right? On those people, because we also have to survive.
Right.
So it's like, some of these things are our means, and that's why I'm saying it's more of it's systematic. It's not just I do get choice,
yeah.
But it's really hard to not to feel like you don't have much choice.
What it all comes down to, the obelisk isn't from here.
Mm-hmm.
Oh shit! The obelisk isn't from
The
here.
obelisk
of
isn't
course.
from here.
It wasn't born here.
No,
It
nothing
doesn't
about
have
it is from
ancestors from here.
Nothing about the obelisk is from here, and it's so funny that people are defending it
Yeah.
by telling people that they're not from here.
Yeah, that is a weird thing. That's
Like,
fucking
the obelisk is the thing that's not from here. That should be the common enemy.
Yeah.
Like the obelisk, nothing about it.
It doesn't have children who live here.
It doesn't have any.
Doesn't pay taxes.
No, it doesn't
It
pay
doesn't
taxes.
pay taxes.
Yeah, the obelisk isn't from here.
Gente, in case you didn't get that, the obelisk isn't from here. After multiple exchanges, debates, and trips down the rabbit hole, Diego, Christian, and I had a big revelation. The revelation was so big, one might even say it was bigly. The obelisk doesn't have roots here. It doesn't have children or ancestors in this region, nor does it pay taxes. It's just not from Santa Fe. The question then is, where exactly is the obelisk from? This second episode of Unsettled looks at the obelisk's arrival at a time when the U.S. military and American merchants were in the process of molding a dusty Mexican town into a refined American city.
It's really interesting, right? Because essentially, monuments by themselves are of little value. I mean, they're essentially stones or metal in a landscape. And, as part of a nation's rights, or the objects of a people's national pilgrimage, they are invested with national soul and memory. So traditionally, that would include state-sponsored memory of a national past, which essentially aims to affirm the righteousness of a nation's birth or a community's birth. So, yeah, I mean, it's static, and we place this additional meaning or significance based on affirming our righteousness to place.
That's Heidi Brandow, a multidisciplinary artist and graduate of Harvard University's School of Design, who hails from a long line of Native Hawaiian singers, musicians, and performers on her mother's side, and Dene storytellers and medicine people on her father's side. As a Story Maps fellow 2 years ago, Heidi looked at Santa Fe's broader landscape of monuments.
We utilized a list that's publicly available through the city of Santa Fe. They basically have created a list of all the monuments which are housed within the city. And I believe that the list has roughly about 65 monuments on the list. And so these particular monuments do not include anything within the county and state monuments. Because definitely there would be a higher number on the list. This is specifically monuments within the city of Santa Fe. So on that, there was once we started to pull all of the data and kind of break things down, I mean, there were any number of directions we decided to focus on a few key areas, one of which was location. So the density of monuments in relationship to their location within Santa Fe. So currently, 80% of memorials are located near the plaza area, so sort of the north east side of Santa Fe, which, I guess is to be expected, but I guess demographically, that also indicates that that particular part of Santa Fe has experienced a significant amount of gentrification. So economically, that side of Santa Fe has a lot more economic means, whereas the south side of town, if I remember correctly, there's roughly about, less than 5 monuments from, say, the central to the south part of Santa Fe, by comparison to the 80% of monuments that are located in the north side of Santa Fe.
What Heidi found maybe wasn't so surprising. Most of the monuments in the city are dedicated to men and to histories of colonization.
Let's see, gender. I broke down, monuments and by the genders that were represented. And of course, over 60% of all of the monuments are dominated by male narratives. And so there's a general disparity in, diversifying what genders are represented within the city monuments. Another aspect that I looked at was ethnicity of who was being represented, what ethnicities were being represented within the city of Santa Fe. And a broad majority of the memorials are in fact related to those of Spanish, Latin, and Anglo-American origin.
The Soldiers' Monument falls squarely within those parameters. It's a monument to men, soldiers, and to 2 separate but entangled wars, the Civil War and the Indian Wars, both of which were interlinked in the West with the American impulse to expand. We might know that expansion is schemed by another name, Manifest Destiny. So let's take it back to the turbulent years between 1846 and 1867, or from the capture of Santa Fe by American forces to the moments leading up to the dedication of the Soldiers' Monument on the plaza. To start this jaunt into the past, Christian and I met up with Dr. Porter Swentzell, a professor of Indigenous Liberal Studies at the Institute of American Indian Art, at his sister Rose B. Simpson's studio. The grouping of buildings is located in the area where La Mesilla morphs into San Pedro. This is also the checkerboard area of Santa Clara Pueblo, where Porter is from. In a way, the region reflects Porter's approach to recounting history. Boundaries and bloodlines aren't clear-cut. It's like mixing dirt with water, he says. And the result is mud. History is mud.
What I think really important when we think about the obelisk is that Santa Fe, the plaza area, would have looked in 1846 like pretty much any Pueblo community today, right? It would have been a plaza area with no trees or grass and open dirt space that would have been used for a whole variety of purposes, as social activities and gatherings and important announcement space, and also ceremony, right? That we talk about church processions and the various celebrations of saints and the regular liturgical schedule. And the Americans, the first thing they do when they see that plaza is they send dragoons into the mountains to cut they say 60-foot tree, right? The tallest pine tree that they could find, and they haul it out of the mountains and they plant it in the center of the plaza, and they run a gigantic American flag up the pole, right? So that's like step one. Plant this gigantic post in the middle of this plaza space, right? And run the biggest American flag that you could imagine.
Yeah, it's like, hear ye,
right.
Hear ye, we are here.
We're here.
Right.
The flag's like bigger than Santa Fe almost, you know? It's like when you see those car dealerships that have like those gigantic flags. That's like what they're planted right in the middle of the plaza.
I wonder what people were thinking at the time, like, what is going on? Right. Because to them, it's like just another government from afar. Like, you're not from here. Yeah. Sticking a stake in the ground saying, claiming, right?
This is ours.
This is ours.
Yeah.
Right, so.
And they, simultaneously started building Fort Marcy on the hill above town, and overlooking the town, specifically with cannons facing onto the town so that they could blow the town to smithereens if they felt like it, because they definitely didn't trust local peoples, right?
So imagine this. Cannons, a giant flagpole with a giant flag, and a sizable military presence. It's the American way, right? And it was only, as Porter says, the first step. When on October 24th, 1867, the fateful day the cornerstone of the obelisk was first laid, there had been a legacy of Americanizing the plaza, of trying to rehabilitate it from something that looked like a Pueblo center might look like today, with no trees and no grass, into a space that looked like an American park in the middle of New Mexico.
And then, so I'm looking through the records of the obelisk, right?
Right.
I'm like looking through the state archives of all these letters going back and forth between people. They're putting in the obelisk and they're saying, but don't mess up the grass.
Right.
And don't mess up the trees. Right. So there was this like communication back and forth where it's like, yeah, go ahead and build it, but keep everything intact for this reason, right? Like this is all new. Right.
Yeah, it's those trees were young when they're putting that up. And one of the soldiers, a later soldier, made it his plan to make the plaza as it is, as we see it now, with the sort of the classic grid of sidewalks on there, a picket fence, planted trees, planted the grass, right? And I really see the planting of grass and the planting of trees as another form of architectural violence, almost as overt as the putting in of that flag, right? Because this was an immediate diss against New Mexican architecture, right? That this dirt plaza is like one of the most critical foundations of New Mexico communal organization, right? That also cross-cuts between Pueblo communities and the Spanish communities as well, right? They're like, the first thing we need to do is plant this giant stick with a flag in there, and the next thing that we need to do is we need to turn this not into a communal gathering space as it always had been, but into this sort of grass tree American park. We need to Americanize this space.
But get off my lawn.
Right, but don't stand on it.
Exactly. But like look at it and appreciate it. Right, because like lawns aren't even American; they're actually British.
Right.
So it's like we've inherited, some kind of also bastardized version of American architecture / public space.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's probably important to note that while plans for the construction of a soldier's monument had very much been in process since the beginning of 1867, the monument itself still wasn't assembled. The original budget had run out, and the 2,000-pound marble tablets had yet to be imported from St. Louis, Missouri, where a firm called E.W. Warren, dealer in American and Italian marble, had been commissioned for $368.40 to chisel out this specific dedication. So, since there wasn't an obelisk yet, a group of men decided to make a big event out of burying a time capsule beneath the cornerstone. I think of the event as a preview of what was to come, like when folks break ground today with giant gold scissors that cut red ribbons while other people posed with shovels for snapping cameras. This groundbreaking had a similar vibe, with processions, music, and lots of oration. Lots. You would have thought someone died or was born, or the Union Army had won the Civil War for a second time. That's just how hyped it was. There were Oddfellows, legislative assembly members, a group of Freemasons, a Masonic chaplain who gave the opening prayer, a delegation from Denver, chief justices, all celebrating the burial of a box, and all to the music of a military band. The Santa Fe Weekly Gazette published the account as the ceremonies attending the laying of the cornerstone of the monument to be erected in the Plaza of Santa Fe in commemoration of the Union soldiers who fell at Valverde and Apache Cañon in the year 1862. It's a mouthful. The write-up was so exhaustive that the Gazette dedicated an entire page of copy to recalling the affair. In fact, you might think that the coverage was part of the performance too, a way of restaging the whole blowout in print for audiences who couldn't witness it in real time, including me. Founded by John T. Russell in the early 1850s, just years after American annexation of New Mexico, the newspaper's motto was, "Independent in all things, neutral in nothing." And if you paid through the Gazette then, you would find news first printed in English and then in Spanish. There were ads for ladies' dresses and fancy goods, announcements for forthcoming meetings about creating a new rail line into Santa Fe, notices from the Internal Revenue Service, and in later issues, coverage of President Andrew Johnson's impeachment proceedings. There was also analysis of the latest sheep raids. It was, by all accounts, a local newspaper with national coverage. That is, it was a newspaper that reflected the transitional place of Santa Fe, pivoting between a Spanish and Mexican past and an American present and future. The list of relics deposited in the cornerstone of the obelisk the Gazette recorded included copies of the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution, and the Organic Act of the Territory of New Mexico, a document that established the terms under which New Mexico would become a territory of the U.S. The Organic Act was also part of a package of 5 separate bills passed by Congress in 1850, now referred to as the Compromise of 1850. These bills really hinged upon the issue of slavery, and particularly black slavery. At the time, Texas was chomping at the bit to claim the newly acquired lands of New Mexico and to expand the reach of the transatlantic slave trade. But in order to pacify said Texans and keep them from encroaching, Congress paid off Texas's debt and permitted the new territories of New Mexico and Utah to decide on their own stance. Besides those documents, the names of those who served on the Monument Commission were also buried beneath the obelisk, alongside issues of all the local newspapers, including the Gazette, and lists of active duty military officers in Santa Fe and the entire territory. There were specimens of coins of the United States buried there, U.S. postage stamps, and Masonic relics, though what those relics could be wasn't revealed. The stone was then lowered, the Gazette wrote, and declared by the Deputy Grand Master to have been properly laid in conformity with the usages of the ancient order of Masons. As trappers on the Santa Fe Trail, some Freemasons had more than a few encounters with New Mexico in the years after 1821. But the real entrance of the Freemasons came just 1 year after the capture of Santa Fe by American forces. In the spring of 1847, Governor John Rawls of Missouri, Grand Master of Masons in that state, sent a company called the 3rd Regiment of Volunteer Missouri Militia to Santa Fe. That company was made up of Freemasons. Colonel Price, who died in the Taos Rebellion of 1847, was also a Freemason. The 1st Regiment of Illinois Fort Volunteers, which created the 2nd military lodge in the territory, also Freemasons. At the same time, Rawls assumed Masonic jurisdiction over the territory of New Mexico until New Mexico's own Grand Lodge was founded in 1877. Freemasons were arriving left, right, and center with the multiple regiments being sent to Santa Fe and New Mexico. Their presence was notable in the invasion and eventual annexation of New Mexico, and they would also go on to found lodges at Fort Union and Fort Marcy. So it's no surprise that the cornerstone laying ceremony on the Santa Fe Plaza for the Soldiers Monument was an out-and-out Freemason fest. It's probably also safe to say that at least some of the soldiers being memorialized at the obelisk that day were in fact Freemasons. It's hard not to think that this whole Freemason thing didn't come straight from a Dan Brown novel or a sequel to National Treasure, but it's true. There are enough Freemasons here to think twice. Not to mention that they really like to bury stuff. But regardless of who they were, the Union soldiers who died were all considered to have been fighting one large rebellion, an umbrella term that was used in the correspondence between members of the Soldiers' Commission and military representatives in Washington, D.C. I have the honor to transmit herewith lists of soldiers killed in the territory of New Mexico during the rebellion, one Sergeant General wrote. Rebellion was spelled with a capital R, like a proper noun. The lists were long and handwritten on now yellowed paper. There were men from multiple regiments of Colorado Infantry, U.S. Infantry, New Mexico Volunteers, and U.S. Cavalry. It was not uncommon for those regiments to have fought off Confederate forces on their way to claim California, but also Native peoples on the plains and throughout the Southwest. One example was the 3rd Cavalry Regiment, who went on to fight Mescalero, Jicarilla, Ute, and Navajo fighters. Later, that same cavalry fought at the Battle of Little Bighorn. Men from the 1st Colorado Infantry Regiment were also named. Led by Pastor and Mason John Chivington, that regiment fought at the Battle of Glorieta Pass in 1862, cutting off the Confederacy's supply train and blunting their ability to move on to take California. The surviving members of that regiment under Chivington went on to lead the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864, where they killed and mutilated close to 200 peaceful members of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes, 2/3 of whom were women and children. And then there were men who belonged to the 1st Cavalry of New Mexico Volunteers, which later became 1st New Mexico Volunteer Cavalry Regiment, organized under Colonel Kit Carson. While that regiment had fought at Valverde, that list in particular included men killed and died of wounds received in different battles and skirmishes with Indians in the territory of New Mexico. Navajo, Utes, and Apaches had been resisting the U.S. Army's attempts to build forts and travel through their territory since the 1840s. And with the Civil War, they depleted supplies of both Union and Confederate camps. In the fall of 1862, 18 months after the start of the Civil War, another war was declared on these native groups. When the Navajos refused to surrender, it was Carson and members of the 1st New Mexico Volunteers who led a coordinated attack that resulted in the Long Walk, the resettlement and internment of several thousand Navajos at Bosque Redondo. Not only did the Confederacy by way of Texas threaten the newly formed territory of New Mexico, so too did bands of native peoples whose own lands were being threatened by the westward advance of white American settlement. That they were considered rebels similar to the Confederacy is, well, ironic, even strategic. But it was most of all violent. The imperial sleight of hand made anybody and everybody that threatened the basis of the nation state, of the Union, all one big rebellion. So fast forward to 1867. I can't help but think that efforts to plant a giant obelisk in the plaza that year expressed just how much American forces still felt threatened, especially since Fort Marcy, established in 1846, was about to close the following year, and also because many of the Indian wars were still ongoing.
There's a welcoming of the American merchants that have moved into town right after during the Mexican period. There's a number of American merchants who set up shop in Santa Fe and allied with local ricos families. And so those families definitely see benefit to this new relationship, right? But there's also a large segment that are not on board. And you can see that with the Taos Revolt. Like, besides the ricos and the American traders, the majority of population is not on board, and the Americans knew this, even though they talk about the welcome parties and hanging out with the local ricos, right? But at the same time, they're putting a fort with guns facing Santa Fe. Like,
okay,
we're
this
gonna
is
blow
important,
this up.
right? Because like Fort Marcy Park, the Cross of the Martyrs, right, where the Franciscans are commemorated, for having been killed during the revolt. So it has this whole new flavor today, right? As this kind of memorial to Spanish identity and to these Franciscans, right? But during the American invasion, and we could call it an invasion, it's not that. This is super important.
Yeah.
And in those instances when nations feel vulnerable, they often throw parties and stage parades. They create symbols of the nation state, craft mythical narratives, and ride the wave of nostalgia. At a symbolic level, they enact performances that legitimate their presence in a specific place. They create spaces where they can belong, even if they're not totally welcome. Which is why this time capsule seems so laden with meaning as it was interred into the ground of the Santa Fe Plaza. Because at that moment, the gesture was a reminder to all of the city, in case anybody had forgotten, that this was an American city. It imported American things, American newspapers, American marble, American trees, American grass, and white picket fences. It also imported American ceremonies, American armed forces, and American architecture.
So they put the stick up, put the flag up, fast forward, then they put another vertical thing up in the plaza, right?
Right. So
the obelisk.
At some point, the flagpole either was relocated and they put a bandstand right in the center of that, where the military bands could play and stuff like that. That was during the Civil War, right? But after the Civil Wars, when the obelisk, immediately following the Civil Wars, when the obelisk is erected in the spot apparently where the bandstand was, and the bandstand was shifted to the side, perhaps where we see it today. Of course it looked different than what we see today, but they kept the bandstand around and they put up the obelisk at that central location, right? But at that same time, there's a real dedicated effort. A lot of the plaza area gets purchased by American merchants, right? And they start to do a lot of remodeling to fix the New Mexican architecture, right? And this is even before the Civil War, because this coincides with Bishop Lamy being installed in Santa Fe. And Bishop Lamy hated New Mexican architecture. Like, he was born in southern France.
Right. Like he wanted stone.
Yeah, he wanted
permanent.
Yeah.
He wanted France.
Right, he wanted France. Yeah, and so he knocked down the old church, right, in Santa Fe. Right. He built a cathedral and then knocked it down from the inside. And so he was on a mission to replace New Mexican architecture, and he wasn't the only one. There was the American merchants. This is where the territorial style comes from. It's that they wanted to build some Greek revival architecture on adobes, right? And so it cost too much to ship bricks over the Santa Fe Trail because the train wasn't quite there yet, right? So they would just put the brick sort of terrace on the top of the building, right, to create that Greek revival thing. They went on a big old operation in Santa Fe to knock down the portals or replace the portals with Greek revival style porches, with square cut beams, and take out the corbels and put in the new style trim. And they remodeled the Palace of the Governors to look more American, right, or as best as they could. Even the New Mexican at that time had countless stories about who had left their adobe fronts
like those guys, right, haven't caught up with the times, kind of thing,
right?
Oh, okay.
And that they're not there with progress, right?
So not only were facades changing to keep up with the times, the obelisk and the time capsule beneath it were just another way to make Santa Fe perform its patriotism. It was no coincidence that this time capsule, buried into New Mexico's own soil, mimicked the most symbolic of all American time capsules. A 10-pound box buried into the cornerstone of the Massachusetts State House in 1795 by none other than Samuel Adams and Paul Revere, who, yes, were also Freemasons. That time capsule contained newspaper clippings of the period, a medal of George Washington, and coins. It was a pretty good template for a territory in transition to follow. Sam Adams and Paul Revere's time capsule was reopened to great fanfare in 1855, just 12 years before this one was installed in the cornerstone of the Soldiers' Monument. By then, it was the American thing to do.
It's hard. I use a word sometimes Spanish very commonly, but at that time, people would identify themselves as Mexicans, right? Who are from New Mexico, they're Mexicans, and so the Americans are absolutely like, these Mexicans are backward. They don't build architecture that's civilized. We need to transform this whole place. And so the obelisk, and at that same time, there's a competition between the traditional customs in Santa Fe, which are mostly church-centric, right? And those regular, the Corpus Christi Day parade and the celebration, the veneration of various saint days and things of that nature, right? So there's that going on, right? But the American traders a number of them are Jewish traders and Northern European traders, and also Americans from Missouri and places like that, who are largely Protestants, besides the group of Jewish traders that are there. They're not part of the rituals of the town, so they decide to really up their game and create their own separate competing group of rituals, right? Including 4th of July, including what becomes Memorial Day, which is comes out of the Civil War, right?
American politicians in the New Mexico Territory decided that besides giving the architecture an American facelift, they also needed to Europeanize the population, to transform people who otherwise considered themselves Mexicans into Spaniards. And this was in order to get the territory permitted into statehood, an effort that had, until that point, failed. The area was just too mixed.
When some of the ricos allied with American traders came up with this whole idea to create New Mexicans as Spanish, Mexicans transforming into Spanish and creating a whole new pageant that was separated away from actual Catholic holidays, right? The original Catholic holidays, because currently fiestas doesn't take place near Corpus Christi time, right? I mean, some years it's closer than others, but Corpus Christi would have originally been much more like the big fiesta almost, right? Whereas Fiestas de Santa Fe is not at that time, right? This allowed Americans to sort of set the stage for that, right? And it was Americans that created fiestas as a way to rehabilitate Mexicans into Spanish.
Oh, I like that. Rehabilitation.
That's exactly what they were trying to do. They were trying to rehabilitate New Mexicans.
It's a Mexican intervention.
Right. That's a Mexican intervention. They were like, we love you because you're Spanish. But I'm not. Soy Mexicano. No, Spanish.
Yeah.
So who are we? Spanish, Mexican, brown people led astray into thinking we're white? Ethnic wanderers with no real patria? At the foot of the Cross of the Martyrs, just adjacent to Fort Marcy Park, Artemisio, Romero, y Carver, Santa Fe's youth poet laureate, spoke to Diego about their experience in attempting to figure out what ethnic group to claim. The confusion over identity, whether national or racial, has in the last century hinged upon defining oneself in opposition to someone else. While my great-grandmother identified as Mexicana, Americanization and the efforts to become a state forced people of mixed descent to not only completely disavow Mexico, but the parts of themselves that were indigenous.
I had this weird moment of like just two different poles. Because part of me had said, I'm alone here and I found someone of a common experience. This is valuable. And then another part of me was relying on the stuff I'd been taught as a child, where they tell you, I'm not Mexican, right? And I should never consider myself Mexican. And I was getting told in both those directions. And then I started looking up the term Chicano. And I started to, like, why in New Mexico? As a New Mexican. It's a 3-letter difference, right? And this is all land that was like initially indigenous and then taken by the Mexican government and then very recently occupied by the U.S. Through violent colonial force. Why don't I identify with anything other than my oppressor?
As Arte spoke, the Santa Fe Police Department parked a van just behind the massive white cross. From the vehicle arose several cameras as the officers stood around overlooking the city. From this view, almost all of the northeast side was visible. The rooftops, parts of the dog patch, Atalaya Mountain, a giant ugly cell tower, and the plaza. As we spoke of trauma, we watched them watch us. In hindsight, it was just another example of how the city and the police department were surveilling public spaces in the aftermath of the obelisks coming down. And how, I wondered, could we heal when the prospect of criminalization was always imminent? How could Santa Fe rebuild when we weren't fully able to examine why a giant hunk of sandstone and marble had driven a wedge in our community in the first place? When the media and the mayor continued to reinforce division rather than consider their own complicity? When the jetsam from waves of colonization continually washed onto our city? Our traumas, fractured and repressed as they were coming back like hauntings, as if released when the obelisk crashed onto the ground. Our city was in pain. Our city is in pain.
This caste system created a gradient of worth, right? It created a gradient of worth to see who is worthy of accessing certain spaces and getting certain privileges at a certain time. How much of the way identity has been constructed in northern Mexico do you think plays into this need for people to fall into kind of the reinforcement, whether it's conscious or not, of white supremacy while still navigating this, identity that they feel like has some sort of relationship to the oppressed or being in a position of oppression?
I think it comes out of, I think like most lies, it comes out of trauma, right?
Mm-hmm.
And an attempt to justify trauma or understand it. And I'd say that there's, an initial trauma in the native genocide. Like my ethnicity, right, as a northern New Mexican or a Chicano or a Latinx person, whatever I want to talk about, didn't exist until after, as a mestizo person, didn't exist until after the native genocide,
Mm-hmm.
Which is an ongoing genocide, but after it had begun, right? And so it's a culture born in like a mass slaughter out of this, relationship. And I think that violence has never been resolved in our culture. And that violence beginning leads us out of a lot of violent means of relating to ourselves. And then the other thing I'd say is that there's another violent instance when the U.S. takes occupation of New Mexico through one of its first imperial wars, a brutal, violent war that included, tactics of rape and slaughter that had never been used other than against indigenous peoples, but were not typical of the kind of warfare at that time historically. They were horrendous, right? There's generals being recounting the war on the American side, but remarking on how horrendous battle tactics they used were. And then after that, the Mexican government, in the view of many New Mexicans, abandoned them, right? It sounds the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. It's also worth mentioning, in my reading of history, the Mexican-American War was a war fought primarily for the right of white Texans to keep slaves.
Those of mixed descent were a people, as Arte said, born of genocide. Their identities, my identity, was the result of an original trauma which had never yet been resolved. Miscegenation, or race mixing in the Americas, challenged any pretenses to racial or ethnic purity.
And out of that, I think you have a group of people who have a variety of identity to choose and relate to, who in the end of that have seen that the only people in these generations of trauma that have been unhurt are white people. And so our culture makes a move to identify with whiteness, not even on its own, but because Lee Baron Bradford Pence, right, a white statesman, and the white politicians who now control New Mexico after its occupation, need a means by which to include New Mexico as a state, and to do that, you can't have a state with this brown population and accept them into the United States. We have to redefine this population in Spanish. So that's how the life starts, and then it gets in our communities, and I think it becomes a means of dealing with trauma.
So just imagine for a second a territory of very brown people who saw themselves as Mexican, being whitewashed in order to be a part of a nation that didn't even want them. The makeover was so coordinated and so convincing it rivaled the makeover of the plaza, a space that was fashioned as just one of the stages for the drama of that new identity to play out.
Now when we think about the modern day fights about the plaza and the obelisk and stuff like that, I guess there's something, I can feel some level of compassion for local New Mexican communities battling for the obelisk. In a way, it's even battling for fiestas, as bizarre as that is because these are some of the last vestiges of holding on to some semblance of control over your hometown, right? As if like your city was slipped out from under your feet, and you were denigrated for decades and decades and decades. And then when the celebration came, it was really just to consume your culture, but not the actual thing, like the Corpus Christi parades and even like the church, which had served as the central part of like celebrations, was destroyed to build like a French cathedral, right? And tourists come to take pictures of this unfinished French cathedral, which was literally a middle finger at New Mexico, right? That church is like a giant middle finger at New Mexico. And the obelisk, in a way, was a middle finger to New Mexico. Like, we're gonna stick this Egyptian symbol that's real like popular for neoclassical sort of like Americans imitating Europeans, stealing Egyptian stuff to put in their city kind of thing, right? And we're going to turn this into a park as a middle finger so that you can no longer do your costumbres y tradiciones, right? Like, we're gonna physically interfere with who you are and take over your town, destroy your architecture, replace it with other stuff. But then when we find out that your architecture is valuable, then we're going to take it for ourselves and plaster over our now it's all fake, right? And do a fake imitation of who you are, but you're not part of it.
Got this pine cone in my brain, got my eyes open, I'm saying it's that wake up, that breaking free for them chains. It's that welcome to a new age.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Tilt Unsettled. This episode was produced by Alicia with interviews by Diego and post-production by Christian. Our theme song is rapper Wake Self's Holy Water. It can be found on his posthumous album, Ready to Live. Unsettled is a 9-part series. Keep listening on our website at sfai.org or the SFAI channel at podbean.com. This project is supported in part by the National Endowment for the Arts.
Holy water, yeah, bump in the trunk, third eye opened up, yeah, bump in the trunk.